Dad, why do those boys look like mech? The question that changed a millionaire's life forever. Alexander Whitmore tried to keep his expression calm as he walked through downtown Chicago with his 8-year-old son, Evan. It was a bright Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when the city seemed almost peaceful. Street musicians played near the sidewalks, tourists moved between cafes and old brick buildings, and the warm sunlight reflected from the glass towers in the distance. Once every month, Alexander made a point of spending an entire day alone with Ethan. No business calls, no meetings, no assistants, just father and son. At least that was what he had promised. They had been heading toward a restaurant when Ethan suddenly stopped walking. His small hand tightened around his father's fingers. Dad, Alexander looked down. What is it, buddy? Ethan was staring across the plaza. Two boys were sitting beside an old brick wall covered in faded graffiti. They were wrapped in worn blankets, and beside them sat a cardboard box containing several packages of candy. Their clothes were old. Their shoes looked too small. One of the boys appeared to be around 12. The younger one looked closer to 10, and then pointed toward them. Dad, why do those boys look like mechs? For a moment, Alexander forgot how to breathe. His eyes moved toward the children. Then his entire world seemed to stop. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The same chestnut brown hair, the same dark eyes, the same shape of the jaw. Even the older boy's hairline curved across his forehead exactly the way Ethan's did. Alexander felt something cold move through his chest. It's probably just a coincidence, he said quietly. He tried to pull Ethan forward. Come on, we're going to be late for lunch. But Ethan refused to move. No, Dad, look. He touched his own forehead. The older Oni's hair grows exactly like mine. Then he pointed toward the younger child. And that one has the same little mole under his chin that I'd have. Alexander forced himself to smile. Inside, however, it felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Then he said more firmly, we're leaving. The boy reluctantly obeyed. But as they walked away, Evan kept looking over his shoulder. Alexander did too. The two boys were thin. Their jackets were worn. Their clothes looked as though they had already belonged to several other children before reaching them. Yet, even from a distance, Alexander could not escape the same disturbing thought. They looked like Ivan, not vaguely, not slightly. They looked like family. By the time Alexander and Evan reached the restaurant, his hands were trembling. He barely touched his food. Across the table, Evan happily talked about school, his friends, and the soccer match he had watched the night before. Normally, Alexander would have listened carefully. Today, he heard almost nothing. His mind kept returning to those two boys. Dad. Alexander looked up. Years. Are you okay? Of course. You look weird. Alexander managed a smile. I am just thinking about work. It then rolled his eyes. You're always thinking about work. Mom says you work too much. Alexander gave a quiet laugh. Your mother is probably right. Then, trying desperately to move the conversation away from the plaza, he asked, how about we go see a movie after lunch? And then immediately brightened. Really? Really? The boy smiled. But Alexander's uneasiness never disappeared. When they returned to their home in Lake Forest that evening, Rebecca Whitmore was outside taking care of the plants near the patio. At 42, Rebecca carried herself with an effortless elegance. She had spent years beside one of Chicago's most successful businessmen and knew exactly how to handle formal dinners, charity events, corporate galas, and the constant pressure of public appearances. More importantly, she had always been a devoted mother and a loyal wife. How was your day? She asked, kissing Ethan on the forehead. It was awesome. Then Ethan added casually, we saw two boys downtown who looked exactly like me. Rebecca paused. Exactly like you. You. Dad said it was a coincidence, but it was really strange. Before Alexander could stop him, Ethan continued. They had my hair, my eyes, even the same mole. Then he ran upstairs toward his room. Rebecca slowly turned toward her husband. What was that about? Alexander shrugged. Nothing. Kids noticed strange things. Two boys who looked exactly like Ethan. You know how imaginative he is. Rebecca studied her husband's face for several seconds. Alexander avoided her eyes. Eventually she let the subject go, but she did not forget it. Alexander went upstairs, entered his home office, locked the door and poured himself a double bourbon. His hand shook as he lifted the glass. That night, he could not sleep. He turned from side to side while Rebecca slept peacefully beside him. At around 3 in the morning, Alexander finally gave up. He quietly left the bedroom, went downstairs, and sat alone in a leather chair overlooking the dark garden. Moonlight covered the lawn. Everything around him was silent, yet his thoughts were deepening. Those boys, that resemblance, it could not mean what he feared it meant. It had to be coincidence. It had to be. By 5 in the morning, Alexander could no longer remain inside the house. He dressed in jeans, a plain sweatshirt, and an old jacket. Without waking Rebecca, he drove back toward the city. When he arrived at the plaza, the boys were gone. A few homeless adults slept beneath nearby awnings. Alexander walked toward the exact place where he had seen the children. A torn blanket had been left behind. Beside it was an empty water bottle, nothing else. He looked around desperately, looking for somebody. Alexander turned. An elderly man with a gray beard was sweeping the sidewalk. I am looking for two boys, Alexander said. They were sitting here yesterday. The man rested both hands on the handle of his broom. Mason and Caleb. Alexander's heart skipped. You know them? Everybody around here knows those boys. Where are they? They don't sleep here every night. The old man nodded toward the south. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks looks after them whenever she can. Who is she? A good woman. Lives over in Pilsen, on West 18th Street. She's been taking care of those boys for years. Alexander felt his pulse quicken. Do you know exactly where? The man gave him the building number. Alexander thanked him and returned to his car. Now the children had names. Mason, Caleb, and someone had been caring for them. They were not simply two anonymous children sleeping on the street. When Alexander returned home, Rebecca was already in the kitchen preparing breakfast. She looked at him in surprise. Where were you? I went jogging. Rebecca stared at him. Jogging? Ye? You haven't gone jogging in years. Alexander opened a cabinet, pretending to search for something. I decided I should start exercising again. Then he quickly added, I am going upstairs to shower. Rebecca watched him leave. She knew her husband. She had known him for 15 years, and she knew when he was lying. During the following week, Alexander found himself unable to concentrate at work. Whitmore Technologies was negotiating several multi-million-dollar contracts, yet Alexander barely listened during meetings. His longtime business partner, Edward Collins, finally stopped him after a conference. Alex, are you all right? I am fine. You haven't been fine all week. I am just tired. Edward looked skeptical. When was the last time you actually took a vacation? Alexander pretended to organize some documents. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe you should. Alexander nodded without really hearing him. His thoughts were elsewhere. Who was Eleanor Brooks? How had she found Mason and Caleb's? Where had those children come from? On Thursday afternoon, Alexander could no longer tolerate the uncertainty. During lunch, he drove to Pilsen. West 18th Street was lined with old apartment buildings, small family businesses, murals, restaurants, and aging brick structures. Alexander slowly walked along the sidewalk searching for the address. A woman sitting outside one building noticed him. You looking for somebody? Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, the woman who takes care of those boys. Alexander nodded. She lives in number 47, second floor. Thank you. Alexander climbed the narrow staircase. The walls were old. Paint peeled from the corners. The building smelled faintly of damp wood and cooking oil. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Nothing. Disappointed, Alexander returned to his office, but he accomplished almost nothing for the rest of the day. The following afternoon he returned. This time he carried grocery bags filled with food, clothing, and basic supplies. It gave him an excuse to be there. He climbed upstairs again and knocked. "Who is it?" A woman called from inside. "My name is Alexander. I'd like to talk to you about Mason and Caleb." The door slowly opened. A woman in her mid-60s stood before him. Her gray hair was tied loosely behind her head. She wore a simple dress beneath a faded apron. Her face looked tired. Her eyes, however, were warm. "What about them? I saw them downtown. I wanted to help." Alexander lifted the bags. Her expression softened slightly, though she remained cautious. "How do you know their names?" "Someone at the plaza told me." Alexander hesitated. "I run a company. We sometimes support children and families in difficult circumstances." It was not exactly true, but it sounded believable. Eleanor studied him carefully. Finally, she stepped aside. "Come in." The apartment was small but remarkably clean. Two mattresses lay on the living room floor, covered with old but carefully repaired sheets. A small table served both as a dining table and a place for homework. Several photographs of the boys hung on the wall inside inexpensive frames. "The boys aren't here," Eleanor explained. "Where are they working?" Alexander frowned. "Working. They're children." "I know." She looked down. "But children still need food." Alexander felt something twist inside his chest. "I do what I can," Eleanor continued, "but my social security check barely covers the rent." Alexander placed the groceries on the table. "How long have they lived with you?" Eleanor's eyes changed. "Since they were babies." Alexander stopped breathing for a second. "Babies? Someone left them outside my door one freezing night." Her voice became softer. "They were so tiny they could barely walk." "Why didn't you call child services?" "I thought about it." She sighed. "But I had already seen too many children disappear into the system. I couldn't bring myself to hand them over." Alexandra's heartbeat grew louder. "Do you know where they came from?" "Not exactly." Eleanor walked toward an old drawer, but there was a note. She returned carrying a yellowed piece of paper. Alexander accepted it with trembling fingers. It read, "Please take care of them. I can't do this anymore. Their father wants nothing to do with us. Their names are Mason and Caleb. They were born on March 15th. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, familiar. Alexander stared at it. "Was there anything else?" Eleanor hesitated. Then she reached into a small box. "This." She handed him a silver necklace with a heart-shaped pendant. The moment Alexander saw it, the room seemed to tilt. He knew that necklace. Years earlier, he had bought it himself for Valerie Carter. Valerie, the young administrative assistant who had once worked for Whitmore Technologies, the woman he had dated before Rebecca, the woman he had abandoned the moment his future seemed more promising elsewhere, the woman who had suddenly disappeared from the company and from his life. Alexander closed his fingers around the necklace. "Are you all right?" Eleanor asked. "I am fine." But he was not. "Where are the boys now?" "They usually sell candy near Michigan Avenue after school." Alexander stood abruptly. "I have to go." Eleanor watched him. "Mr. Whitmore." Alexander stopped. "If you know who those children are, if they belong to you, don't wait too long." He slowly turned. "They're growing up. They ask questions. And I am getting too old to carry all of this alone." Alexander left the building with trembling legs. He drove to a nearby bar and ordered a double bourbon. The necklace felt as though it were burning through his pocket. He had not thought seriously about Valerie for years. He had trained himself not to. Back then, she had been young, intelligent, ambitious, and beautiful. She had joined his company as an intern and quickly distinguished herself. Alexander had been single at the time and almost completely obsessed with building his career. At first, he and Valerie simply had dinner together. Then dinners became evenings. Evenings became weekends. And eventually, their relationship became serious. At least it had been serious to Valerie. Then, Alexander met Rebecca at a business event. Rebecca came from a respected Chicago family. She had connections, education, social influence. Marrying her made sense not only emotionally, but professionally. Alexander saw a future, so he ended things with Valerie quickly, coldly, without giving her a real explanation. A few weeks later, Valerie resigned. Alexander never asked why. He had been too busy planning his wedding and expanding his company. Now, more than a decade later, he was sitting alone in a bar holding the necklace he had once placed around Valerie's neck. And suddenly the truth became horrifyingly clear. She had been pregnant. Those boys were very likely his sons. When Alexander returned home that night, Rebecca immediately smelled alcohol. "You've been drinking." "Just a couple drinks with a client." "What client?" "A new investor." "Oh, you and T know him." Alexander went upstairs before she could continue questioning him. Later, he sat on Ethan's bedroom floor helping him assemble a puzzle. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan asked, "Dad, yes, do you remember those boys?" Alexander's hand froze over the puzzle piece. "What boys?" "The ones who looked like me." "Oh, I keep thinking about them." Wake Ethan looked down. "I wonder if they have a home." Alexander said nothing. "And I'd wonder if they have a mom and dad." The words struck Alexander harder than any accusation could have. "If I didn't have you and mom," Evan continued, "yeah, I think I'd be really sad." Alexander pulled his son into his arms. For the first time in years, guilt overwhelmed him so intensely that he almost could not brave it. The following Saturday, Alexander drove alone to Michigan Avenue. It did not take long to find them. Mason and Caleb stood near an intersection selling candy to drivers waiting at a traffic light. From a distance, the resemblance to Ethan became even more disturbing. The same hair, the same eyes, the same smile. Alexander parked nearby and watched them for almost an hour. They were polite. They never argued with drivers. When somebody refused to buy anything, they simply smiled, thanked them anyway, and moved on. Finally, Alexander gathered enough courage to approach. "Hey, Gus." The older boy looked toward him. "Hello, sir. You have strawberry candy?" "Yeah." He opened the box. Alexander smiled. "I'll take 4." He handed them a $20 bill. Cal looked confused. "Sir, they're only $2 each." "Keep the change." The boys stared at each other. "Seriously, seriously." "Thank you, sir." Alexander remained there talking with them between traffic light cycles. He learned that Mason was the older brother. Caleb was younger. They both attended a nearby public school. Despite everything, they talked about their futures with remarkable optimism. "One day, I am going to have a big house," Caleb said, "and I am going to let Mason and Grandma Eleanor live there too." Mason smiled. "I am going to be a doctor." "A doctor, ye?" "I want to help people who can't afford one." Alexander had to look away for a moment. His eyes had begun to burn. The doubts were disappearing. The ages, the resemblance, the necklace, Valerie. Everything pointed toward the same answer. These boys were his children. Over the next several weeks, Alexander returned again and again. He always bought candy. He always talked to them. Little by little, he learned about their lives. They were good students despite their circumstances. Eleanor helped with homework whenever she could. On weekends, they sold candy to contribute toward rent and food. "Grandma Eleanor makes the best chili in Chicago," Caleb said one afternoon. Mason laughed. "That is not true." "It is." "It has not." Alexander smiled. "Do you remember your biological mothers?" Both boys became quiet. "No," Mason said. "Grandma Eleanor says she was really young. She told us our mom couldn't take care of us," Caleb added. "She said she'd explain everything when we were older." Alexander felt a sharp pain in his chest. Valerie had been alone, and he had walked away. But another thought immediately followed. He had a wife, a son, A reputation, a life that had been built in a very specific way. What would happen if he suddenly announced that two children from his past were his sons? Would Rebecca stay? Would Ethan understand? Would his family collapse? Dear listener, if you are enjoying this story, take a moment to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us continue bringing you stories like this. Now, let us continue. Rebecca had begun noticing Alexander's strange behavior. He disappeared more frequently on weekends. He came home distracted. Sometimes his expensive clothes smelled like city streets, cheap food, and exhaust fumes. One Sunday morning, after Ethan went outside to play, Rebecca confronted him. Alexander, we need to talk. He continued looking at his newspaper. About what? About whatever has been happening to you. Guys, don't he know what you're talking about? Don't he do that? Rebecca crossed her arms. I've known you for 15 years. Alexander lowered the newspaper. You're disappearing every weekend. You're distracted. You barely sleep. She paused. Are you having an affair? Alexander stared at her. What? No. Then explain what is happening. There is nothing happening. I called Edward last week. Alexander's stomach dropped. He said you haven't been at the office on Saturdays. Alexander slowly stood. I've been handling something personal. Rebecca laughed bitterly. Personal? We're married. Your personal problems affect me too. It's complicated. Then explain it. I need more time. You've needed more time for almost a month. Rebecca's voice broke slightly. If you're seeing another woman, Alexander, tell me now. I am not. Then what? Alexander walked toward the window. For several seconds, he remained silent. Finally, he said, I've been thinking about things I did before we were married. Rebecca's expression changed. What things? People I hurt. Women. Alexander did not answer immediately. Rebecca understood. What exactly did you do? Alexander turned. I made mistakes. Serious mistakes. That still doesn't explain where you've been. I am trying to correct something from my past. Rebecca studied him. Will this affect our family? Alexander looked directly at her. Yes. The single word made Rebecca go pale. How? I am not ready to tell you yet. Alexander, please. He walked toward her. I love you. I love Ethan. You two are everything to me. But something from my past may have consequences now. Rebecca looked at him for a long time. Finally she whispered, when you know the truth. I expect to hear all of it. You will. No more lies. No more lies. But Alexander had already told too many. The following Monday, he hired a private investigator named Marcus Reed. Marcus had worked discreetly for Whitmore Technologies several times in the past. I need you to find someone. Marcus opened a notebook. Name, Valerie Carter. How long since you last saw her? About 12 years. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That has a while. She used to work for my company. Any reason you're looking? Alexander had prepared an excuse. We're developing an outreach program for former employees. Marcus watched him. You need a private investigator for an alumni program. Alexander gave him a cold look. Marcus shrugged. Fair enough. Give me whatever records you have. Several days passed. Alexander continued visiting Mason and Calvin. One afternoon Mason finally asked, Mr. Alexander, you? Can I ask you something? Of course. Why do you always come talk to us? Alexander froze. Mason continued. Most adults buy candy and leave. Caleb nodded. You stay. Alexander struggled for an answer. You remind me of someone important. Who? My son. Both boys looked interested. You have a son? Yes. His name is Ethan. How old is he? 8. Caleb smiled sadly. He's lucky. Alexander swallowed. Why do you say that? Because he has a dad who cares enough to spend time with him. Alexander felt as though someone had driven a knife through his chest. Without thinking, he asked, would you guys like to meet him? Both boys looked surprised. Really, really. The moment he said it, Alexander regretted it. How would he explain this to Rebecca? How would he explain it to Ethan? Still, he had already promised. That Friday Marcus called. I found Valerie. Alexander immediately stood from his desk. Where? She goes by Valerie Bennett now. Married about 8 years ago to a man named Daniel Bennett. Alexander gripped the phone. She lives in Evanston and teaches at a public elementary school. Children? None registered with her current husband. Alexander closed his eyes. Of course, there were no children registered under her current household. Mason and Caleb had spent their lives with Eleanor. Do you have an address? Home and work. Marcus hesitated. Alex, yes, I've done this job for 20 years. Alexander remained silent. This doesn't he feel like an employee outreach program? Alexander said nothing. Marcus continued, whatever this is, if you need advice, you can call me. Thank you. Alexander ended the call. Valerie had rebuilt her life. She had married. Did her husband know? Did she still think about the boys? Did she know where they were? The next Saturday, Alexander told Rebecca that an old college friend named Frank was visiting Chicago with his sons. It was another lie. Frank? Rebecca asked. Yes. You've never mentioned Frank. We lost touch. And now suddenly you are taking Ethan to meet his children. Alexander tried to sound casual. He called this week. Rebecca clearly did not believe him, but she allowed Ethan to go. During the drive, Ethan was excited. How old is Frank's son? Actually, there are two boys, brothers. Yee. How old? They're a little older than you. When they reached the intersection, Alexander spotted Mason and Caleb. The boys smiled when they saw him. Hey, Mr. Alexander. Then they noticed Ethan. Both of them stopped moving. Ethan stopped too. For several seconds, the three boys simply stared at one another. Standing together, the resemblance was astonishing. A woman passing on the sidewalk laughed. Whoa. You three look like brothers. Alexander's heart began pounding, and then pulled on his sleeve. Dad. Alexander knew what was coming. Why do they look exactly like Meg? And then no, Dad. Look. He pointed toward Mason. His hair grows exactly like mine. Then toward Caleb. And he has the same mole. Mason touched his own chin. He's right. Caleb stared at Ethan. You really do look like us. Alexander quickly tried to change the subject, but the children were fascinated with each other. They spent hours talking. You like soccer? Mason asked. I love it. What team? Chicago Fire. Caleb grinned. Us too. What kind of pizza? Pepperoni. That is our favorite. What is your favorite subject? Math, Ethan said. Mason laughed. No way. It is. Mine too. Alexander watched them with a mixture of joy and fear. Their connection seemed instant, natural, as though the three had known one another their entire lives. On the drive home, Ethan remained silent for several minutes. Finally he said, Dad. Yes, yeah, I think they're my brothers. Alexander nearly drifted into the next lane. Then Dante say that, I am serious. People can look alike. It isn't just how they look. Ethan crossed his arms. They talk like me. They like the same things. They even smile like me. Alexander said nothing. And they don't have a dad, do they? Why are you asking that? Because of how happy they look when you come around. Alexander gripped the steering wheel harder. When they returned home, Rebecca was in the living room reading. How did it go? Good, Ethan said. Rebecca smiled. So what did you think of your daddy's friend's children? Ethan looked toward Alexander, then toward his mother. There were two boys, too, and they look exactly like me. Rebecca slowly lowered the magazine. What do you mean? Like brothers? Alexander immediately interrupted. Ethan has been obsessed with this resemblance. Yeah, I am not obsessed, Ethan protested. They really look like me. Rebecca stood. Her eyes moved toward Alexander. We need to talk. They went into his office. The moment Rebecca closed the door, she turned on him. What the hell is going on? Rebecca, Dante. Her voice shook. You disappear every weekend. You lie about being at work. You invent a college friend. Then our son comes home saying he met two children who look like his brothers. Alexander sat down. He covered his face with both hands. There was nowhere left to hide. Before we were married, he began slowly, I was involved with someone who worked for my company. Rebecca's face tightened. Her name was Valerie. And when I met you, I ended it. Rebecca stared. I ended it badly. How badly? I simply walked away. Rebecca's voice became colder. What does that have to do with those boys? Alexander finally looked at her. I think Valerie was pregnant when he left her. Silence. Rebecca did not move. And you believe those boys, yes? Her voice dropped to a whisper. Are your children? I don't know for certain yet. Rebecca walked several steps away. Oh my God. I am going to have a DNA test. Alexander, she turned toward him. You're telling me there may be two children living in poverty because you abandoned their mothers. I didn't know. You didn't know because you never bothered to find out. The words hit him hard. Rebecca continued. You broke up with a woman, she disappeared, and you never once wondered why. Alexander could not defend himself. You're right. That isn't enough. I know. If those children are yours, you abandoned them before they were even born. Alexander looked down. Every word was true. Finally, he asked, what do you want me to do? Rebecca's expression softened slightly. I want you to find out the truth, and then you tell me everything. She paused. And if those boys really are yours, they are Ethan's brothers? Alexander looked at her. That means they are part of our family, whether we planned for it or not. The following week, Alexander arranged a private paternity test. The laboratory technician explained that they needed samples from Alexander and both boys. Saliva is easiest, the technician said. How long for results? Normally about 2 weeks, and expedited approximately 1 week. Alexander paid for expedited processing. Now he needed samples. A few days later, he brought Mason and Caleb sandwiches and bottled drinks. They ate together while talking. Afterward, Alexander casually collected the empty bottles. I'll throw those away. I can do it, Mason offered. It tastes fine. At the laboratory, technicians were able to obtain usable genetic material. Then came the longest week of Alexander Whitmore's life. He barely slept. Rebecca remained distant. Ethan sensed the tension immediately. One morning at breakfast, he asked, are you guys fighting because of those boys? Alexander nearly dropped his coffee. Rebecca looked toward Ethan. We're not fighting. You've been acting weird since I met them. Rebecca exchanged a look with Alexander. Finally, she said, your dad is trying to fix something from his past. Ethan thought for a moment. Those boys are part of his past. Made. Ethan nodded slowly. They're my brothers. Alexander stared at him. How can you be so sure? Because it makes sense. Ethan counted on his fingers. They look like me. They don't have a dad. You started acting strange after seeing them. Then he touched his chest. And when I met them, I felt something. What? I don't know. He shrugged, like I already knew them. Rebecca stood and hugged him. You're an extraordinary kid. He then looked at Alexander. If they're my brothers, I want to help them. Alexander swallowed. It isn't fair that I have a house and food and a good school while they sell candy outside. A few days later, the laboratory called. Mr. Whitmore, your results are ready. I'll come personally. Alexander arrived within the hour. The technician handed him a sealed envelope. His fingers shook as he opened it. He read the report, then read it again. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. Alexander Whitmore was the biological father of Mason Carter and Caleb Carter. Alexander leaned against the counter. The technician looked concerned. Sir, are you all right? Yes, but his voice barely worked. He returned to his car and sat behind the wheel holding the report. He had 3 sons, not 1. 3. When he arrived home, Rebecca immediately knew it's true, isn't it? Alexander silently handed her the document. She read it, closed her eyes, then whispered, "Oh God." After several seconds she asked, "Where is Ethan?" "Upstairs. We're telling him." "Now?" "Yes, now." They entered Ethan's room. He was working on math homework. Rebecca sat beside him. "We need to tell you something." They then looked at both parents. "It's about Mason and Caleb." Alexander sat on the edge of the bed. "Yes, they're my brothers." Alexander took a deep breath. "Yes, Ethan." The boy did not look surprised. "Mason and Caleb are your half-brothers." Ethan exhaled as if a puzzle had finally been solved. "Yeah, I knew it." Rebecca looked astonished. "You knew?" "I felt it." Alexander's eyes filled with tears. "There is something else you need to understand." "What?" "They have had a very different life from yours." Ethan nodded. "I know. This changes things for our family." Ethan looked confused. "Changes them in a good way, right?" Alexander had no immediate answer, and then continued, "Because now I have brothers." Rebecca smiled through tears. Then Ethan said the simplest thing of all, "So we help them." Alexander looked at his son. "Yes, we bring them here." "It's more complicated." "Why?" "They have someone who raised them, Mrs. Eleanor." Ethan nodded. "We shouldn't take them away from her." "Exactly. But we also can't let them keep living like that." Alexander reached out and squeezed his son's shoulder. "No, we can't." That weekend Alexander went to Eleanor's apartment. She opened the door. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to tell you something." Eleanor invited him inside. Alexander sat. "I did a DNA test." Eleanor watched him quietly. "They're my sons." "I know." Alexander stared at her. "You knew, not scientifically." She smiled faintly. "But I have eyes." Alexander lowered his head. "I need to find Valerie." Eleanor's expression changed. "You know where she is?" Alexander asked. "Yes, why didn't you tell me?" "Because before I did, you needed to decide who you wanted to be." Alexander remained silent. Then Eleanor told him the truth. Valerie had never willingly abandoned her children. After Alexander left her, she had tried repeatedly to contact him. She called his office. Messages were never passed along. She went to Whitmore Technologies. Security refused to let her upstairs. She sent letters. No reply came. She even went to his home once. A housekeeper told her Alexander was unavailable. Alexander went pale. "I never knew." "I believe you," Eleanor continued, "but Valerie didn't. During her pregnancy, she lost her job. Eventually, she lost her apartment. For a time, she slept wherever she could. After the boys were born, she tried to care for them alone. But feeding 2 infants without money became impossible. That was when she brought them to Eleanor. She never intended for it to be permanent," Eleanor explained. "She thought she would find work, find housing, and come back." "Did she?" "She tried." "How often?" "At first every few months." Eleanor sighed. "Later, twice a year. Now at least once a year." Alexander stared at the floor. "She came 2 months ago." "What happened?" "She wanted to take them." Alexander looked up. "And they refused." "Why? They barely know her." Eleanor's voice softened. "To Mason and Caleb I am home." Alexander finally understood. Valerie had not stopped loving them, but time had created a distance love alone could not erase. Eleanor gave Alexander Valerie's phone number. "Before you call," she warned him, "decide what you actually want." "I want to take responsibility." "Then understand that Valerie has spent more than a decade carrying pain you helped create." Alexander drove to a nearby park. For almost 20 minutes, he stared at the number. Finally, he called. "Hello." The voice was older, but he recognized it immediately. "Valerie." Silence. "It's Alexander." The silence became heavier. Alexander's. "Yes. How did you get my number?" "I spoke with Eleanor." Valerie's breathing changed. "What do you want?" I know about Mason and Caleb. Another silence. You know, I did a DNA test. Alexander closed his eyes. They're my sons. He heard Valerie begin to cry. Then the grief in her voice turned into anger. 12 years? Valerie, 12 years, Alexander. Yeah, I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. I swear I tried to tell you. Her voice rose. I called your office. Yeah, I came to your company. Yeah, I sent letters. Yeah, I went to your house. Alexander gripped the phone. No one told me that was convenient, wasn't it? Valerie, do you know what it was like being pregnant with two babies and knowing their father had erased me from his life? Alexander said nothing. Do you know what it was like giving birth alone? Yeah, I am sorry. Sorry. Her voice broke. I slept under an awning when I was 7 months pregnant because I couldn't pay rent. Alexander covered his face. He was crying now. Yeah, I didn't know. You keep saying that. Yeah, I know. Where was your responsibility then? Why I failed you? You abandoned me. Yes, you abandoned them. Yes. For the first time, Alexander stopped defending himself. I was a coward. Valerie became quiet. I can't change what I did. No, but I can change what I do now. Valerie gave a bitter laugh. Now, yes, now that the hard years are over, Alexander closed his eyes. I deserve that. You think money fixes this? No. You think because you're rich you can suddenly give them a house and become dad? No. Then what exactly do you want? I want a chance to become part of their lives. Valerie remained silent. Alexander continued, I want to help them. I want to know them. I want them to know me. Being a father is more than biology. Yeah, I know. Do you? I am learning. Valerie's voice softened only slightly. If you enter their lives, you don't get to disappear again. Yeah, I want to. You already did once. Yeah, I know. And I have no reason to trust you. You're right. That answer surprised her. Alexander continued, I am not asking you to forget what I did. What are you asking? To meet? Valerie sighed. My husband knows everything. I understand. I am bringing him. That's fine. They agreed to meet the following afternoon near Holy Name Cathedral. When Alexander told Rebecca about the conversation, she listened quietly. She hates me. She has reasons to. I know. Are you still going? Yes. Rebecca put her hand on his shoulder. Then listen more than you speak. The next afternoon, Alexander arrived early. 15 minutes later, he saw Valerie approaching. She looked older, more mature, yet unmistakably herself. Beside her walked a tall man with a calm expression. Alexander. Valerie. She gestured toward the man. This is my husband, Daniel Bennett. Daniel offered his hand. Nice to meet you. Thank you for coming. They sat together. Valerie immediately established conditions. First, the boys don't know you're their father. Alexander nodded. If you become part of their lives, you build that relationship from nothing. I'd understand. Second, I don't trust you. I'd understand that too. If you make promises to them and break those promises, you're finished. Alexander nodded again. Third, decisions about Mason and Caleb will not be yours alone. Valerie looked directly into his eyes. They involve me, you, Eleanor, and, when necessary, Daniel. Agreed. Daniel finally spoke. I have a question. Go ahead. Does your wife know? Yes. And your son? Yes. How did he read? Alexander smiled faintly. He recognized them before any of us knew the truth. Valerie raised her eyebrows. He said he felt like they were his brothers. For the first time, some of the anger disappeared from Valerie's face. What do you want to do? She asked. Alexander thought carefully. I want to be their father. Valerie immediately responded. You aren't. Not yet. That answer made her pause. I want to earn the right. Daniel leaned forward. Are you willing to help them even if they never live with you? Alexander frowned slightly. What do you mean? Eleanor is their home, Valerie explained. Taking them away from her immediately could destroy them emotionally. Alexander slowly nodded. So what do you suggest? Improve the life they already have, Daniel continued. Help Eleanor move somewhere better, pay for the boys' education, medical insurance, Valerie added, clothes, stability, and be present, Daniel said, not as a man who writes checks, as someone who shows up. Alexander thought about it. It was not what he had imagined, but it made sense. Finally he said, I'll do it. Valerie looked at him carefully. We go slowly. As slowly as necessary. If they get hurt because of this, they want to. You can't promise that. Alexander corrected himself. I'll do everything I can to make sure they don't. That was the beginning. The first major change was Eleanor's home. Alexander arranged a clean, comfortable apartment for her and the boys, 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, a safe neighborhood. He also enrolled Mason and Caleb in a strong private school nearby and provided health insurance, clothing, books, and school supplies. To avoid overwhelming the boys, they explained that Whitmore Technologies had launched a program supporting families facing hardship. For once, that statement was not entirely a lie, because after meeting Mason and Caleb, Alexander actually created such a program. When the boys moved into their new apartment, they could hardly believe it. Is this really ours? Caleb asked. As long as you take care of it, Eleanor said. Forever. Alexander smiled. Forever. The boys ran into their new bedroom, and then visited shortly afterward. The 3 boys immediately resumed their friendship, as though no time had passed. Over the following months, Alexander became a regular presence. He helped with homework, attended school activities, took them to soccer games, taught them things, listened to them. Slowly, Mason and Caleb began seeing him as something more than a wealthy man helping their family. They began calling him Uncle Alex. Then one afternoon Mason asked, Uncle Alex, yes, do you have children besides Ethan? Alexander's heart began pounding. He had been waiting for this opening. Yes. Both boys looked surprised. I have 2 more sons. Really, really. Where are they? Alexander smiled nervously, very close. Caleb stared at him. Then his face changed. Wait. Alexander said nothing. Caleb whispered, You mean us? The room went silent. Alexander lowered himself so he was at eye level with them. Yes. Mason stared at him. What? Why, I am your biological father. Neither boy spoke. Finally Mason asked, But Athanas' mom is your wife? Yes. Then who is our mom? Valerie. Caleb's eyes widened. The woman who visits Grandma Eleanor sometimes. Yes, that is our mom. Alexander nodded. Mason looked hurt. Why didn't anyone tell us? Because the adults in your life made mistakes. Alexander took a slow breath. I made the biggest one. Caleb's eyes filled with tears. You didn't want us? The question nearly broke Alexander. No, he moved closer. No, Caleb, please understand this. I didn't reject you because there was something wrong with you. I failed before I even knew what kind of boys you would become. I was selfish. I was afraid of responsibility. And by the time I learned the truth, years had passed. Mason stared at him. Do you want us now? Alexander's voice cracked. More than I can explain. Caleb asked quietly, Can we still live with Grandma Eleanor's? Of course. Alexander smiled through tears. She is your family. I would never take you away from her. I am not here to replace anyone. I only want to add more love to your lives. Mason slowly walked toward him. Then he wrapped his arms around Alexander. Dad. Alexander closed his eyes. It was the first time he had heard the word from him. Caleb joined the hug. Dad. Alexander held both boys. For the first time, he felt that a missing piece of his life had returned. I love you, he whispered. We love you too, Mason said. That weekend, Mason and Caleb visited Alexander's home for the first time knowing the truth. Rebecca welcomed them at the door. Welcome home. The boys were nervous. Hi, Rebecca. You can call me Rebecca, she smiled. Or whatever makes you comfortable. And then came running down the stairs. They know. Alexander nodded. And then his face lit up. You know we're brothers. Mason laughed. Yield. And then threw his arms around both of them. Lunch that afternoon was surprisingly natural. At one point Caleb looked toward Rebecca. Can I ask something? Anything? Were you mad when you found out Dad had other kids? Rebecca glanced toward Alexander. Then she answered honestly. At first I was hurt. Because of us? No. She shook her head immediately. Never because of you. I was hurt because of decisions your father made many years ago. But then I realized something. What? Rebecca smiled. Children should never have to pay for the mistakes adults make. Mason hesitated. Do you get jealous that you have to share Dad with us? Rebecca smiled. Love doesn't work that way. What way? It doesn't get smaller when you share it. She looked toward the three boys. It multiplies. Those words stayed with all of them. Over the following months, Mason and Caleb spent more weekends with Alexander's family. Valerie also began rebuilding her relationship with the boys. At first it was difficult. They did not naturally think of her as their mother. Eleanor had filled that role for almost their entire lives. One day Mason finally asked Valerie, "Why did you leave us?" Valerie's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't leave because I didn't love you. Then wait, because I was young, poor, and afraid." She took his hand. "I believed Eleanor could give you something I couldn't give you then. Safety." Caleb asked, "Why didn't you come back sooner?" "I tried." Valerie swallowed. "But when I came you didn't recognize me. You were afraid. I kept thinking that forcing myself into your lives might hurt you." Mason looked toward Eleanor. "She'll always be our mom too." Valerie nodded. "She should be." Then she whispered, "I don't want to replace her. I just hope you'll let me become another person who loves you." Little by little, the unusual family found a rhythm. Mason and Caleb continued living with Eleanor. Alexander became a present father. Rebecca became a loving stepmother, and then became the younger brother they adored. Valerie slowly reclaimed a place in her sons' lives. Daniel became a gentle, supportive stepfather. No one tried to erase anyone else. Instead, the family expanded. Alexander's experience also changed Whitmore Technologies. What had originally been a convenient excuse became a genuine charitable program. The company began supporting families facing housing insecurity. It provided scholarships, medical assistance, school supplies, emergency housing. Edward Collins noticed the transformation. "What happened to you?" he asked Alexander one afternoon. "What do you mean?" "You used to measure everything in profit." Alexander smiled. Fatherhood happened. About a year after the truth came out, the entire extended family gathered for Ethan's birthday. Mason and Cale were healthier now, more confident, doing well in school. During dinner, Mason stood with a glass of soda. "I want to make a toast." Everyone became quiet. To Ethan grinned. "It's my birthday." "Of course you do." Everyone laughed. Mason continued. "But Ethan gave Caleb and me something bigger than any birthday present." "What?" Ethan asked. "A family." The room became silent. "If you hadn't pointed at us that day," Caleb continued, "if you hadn't asked Dad why we looked like you." Mason looked toward Alexander. "He might never have found us." Alexander felt tears rising, and then stood. "Actually, you guys gave me something too." "What?" "Brothers." Rebecca raised her glass. "I'd like to say something." Everyone turned to this strange, complicated, blended, imperfect family. She smiled. "We proved that family is not only about who is born together, it is also about who chooses to stay." Everyone lifted their glasses. "To family." Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes. I raised those boys from the time they were babies. She looked at Alexander. I always worried I could never give them everything. You gave them what mattered most, Alexander said. You gave them love when no one else was there. Valerie stood and embraced Eleanor. Thank you for being their mother when I couldn't. Eleanor shook her head. You never stopped being their mother. You were simply lost for a while. Years passed. Mason continued talking about becoming a doctor so he could help low-income children. Caleb became fascinated with engineering and dreamed of designing affordable housing. He then wanted to become a professional soccer player and represent the United States one day. One evening, Alexander stood alone on the balcony. Rebecca joined him. What are you thinking about? One question. What question? Alexander smiled. Dad, why do those boys look like mech? Rebecca smiled too. That question changed everything. It forced me to face a life I had tried to forge it. It made me confront the worst version of myself. And it made me become someone better. Rebecca leaned against him. Do you regret anything? I regret what I did to Valerie. I regret missing Mason and Caleb's childhood. I regret not being there when they needed me. He looked toward the garden where the three boys were laughing. But I don't regret what happened after I found them, even the difficult parts, especially the difficult parts. They changed us. A couple of years later, Evan found an old photograph inside his father's office. Dad. Alexander turned. What? Look what I found. Evan held up a photograph of a much younger Alexander standing beside Valerie. Mason and Caleb walked over. Who's that? Alexander accepted the photograph. Your mother. Mason studied it. You both look happy. We were. Then why did you leave? Alexander sat down. Because sometimes people convince themselves they want one life when their heart is telling them something else. Do you regret leaving her? I regret hurting her. Alexander looked at Ethan. But life is complicated. If everything had happened differently, maybe Ethan wouldn't be here. Mason nodded slowly. And maybe we wouldn't have had Grandma Eleanor. Exactly. Caleb smiled. She taught us things maybe you couldn't have. Like what? To appreciate small things, to help people who have less, to be grateful. Alexander hugged the boys. Then she taught you better than I could have. Then a few months later, Alexander decided to do something even more unusual. He bought a large property outside Chicago. There was a main house and two smaller homes on the same land. Alexander, Rebecca, and Evan lived in the main house. Eleanor moved into one of the smaller houses with Mason and Caleb. Valerie and Daniel moved into the other. It then laughed on moving day. It's like our own family neighborhood. Alexander smiled. That's basically what it is. Each household kept its privacy, but the children could see everyone every day. Sunday meals became large family gatherings. There was laughter, noise, arguments over television, soccer in the yard, homework at the kitchen table, barbecues, birthday parties, and more love than Alexander had ever believed one life could hold. One afternoon, Ethan approached his father while Alexander was trimming bushes. Dad, yes, do you think our family would be completely different if I had never asked that question? Alexander put down the gardening shears. Yes. Does that make you feel bad? No. Ethan looked thoughtful. Sometimes it makes me feel important. You should. Really, you saw something adults might have ignored. Alexander smiled. You saw two children and didn't see poor kids. You saw people who looked like you. You asked why. And because you asked why, all of us eventually had to search for the answer. That evening, Eleanor made an announcement at dinner. I want to tell everyone something. The family became quiet. I've spent most of my life worrying about Mason and Callum. Mason smiled. You worry about everything. Everyone laughed. Eleanor continued. I always wondered whether I was doing enough. You or Caleb said, you gave us everything. No. Eleanor shook her head. I gave you what I could. But now I realize something. What? Valerie asked. I was the bridge. Alexander frowned. A bridge between what those boys lost and what they eventually found. Alexander shook his head. You rent a bridge. You're part of the destination. Eleanor smiled. And that makes me very happy. Valerie hugged her. Daniel looked around the table. I grew up as an only child. He left. Now somehow I have brothers, sisters, nephews, children, grandparents, and enough relatives to fill a restaurant. Ethan pointed at him. And we have an awesome stepdad, and one who makes the best brownies, Mason added. Daniel bowed dramatically. Finally, someone appreciates my talent. Everyone laughed. Several years after that first afternoon in Chicago, Evan approached Alexander with another idea. Dad, remember the question I asked when we found Mason and Caleb? How could I forge it? I think we should write a book. Alexander laughed. A book about us? Why? Because maybe another family is going through something similar. Wethen became increasingly excited. Maybe there's a father who made a terrible mistake, or a mom who had to give up a child, or kids who don't know their parents. Our story could show them that things can still change. Alexander stared at his son. You're serious? Very. How would we write it? Everyone tells their side. Mason tells his part. Caleb tells his, Mom tells hers, Valerie, Daniel, Grandma Eleanor, and you. Alexander smiled. And you, obviously. That Sunday, Evan presented the idea to the entire family. To his surprise, everyone agreed. So every Sunday evening, they gathered in the living room and recorded memories. Valerie talked about discovering she was pregnant. At first, I was happy, she said, then afraid. Then desperate. Mason asked, what was the hardest day? The day I left you with Eleanor. Valerie wiped away tears. It broke me. But I also knew you would be safer. Caleb asked Eleanor, why did you keep us? Eleanor smiled. Because you needed love. That's it, that's enough. Then Mason asked Alexander, what was the hardest moment for you? Alexander did not hesitate. When you asked whether I had ever wanted you, and the happiest, the first time you called me Dad. The book project became something like family therapy. They discussed fear, anger, forgiveness, jealousy. Rebecca admitted that she had initially been terrified. I thought Mason and Caleb would take Alexander away from Ethan and me. Did what? Mason asked. No, Rebecca smiled. You brought us more family. Valerie asked. Wasn't it hard accepting such an unusual situation? Very. Rebecca nodded. But I learned that whether a family looks traditional doesn't matter nearly as much as whether the people inside it love one another. 6 months later, the book was finished. They titled it, Dad, Why Do Those Boys Look Like Mech? At first, they printed only a few copies for relatives, but friends who read it encouraged Alexander to publish it. Eventually he did. To everyone's surprise, the book became successful. Letters began arriving from readers. One afternoon, Mason brought Alexander an envelope. Dad, you need to read this. Alexander opened it. The letter was from a 45-year-old woman named Sandra. She wrote that more than 20 years earlier, she had placed her daughter for adoption because she was unable to care for her. For decades, she believed it was too late to reconnect. After reading the Whitmore family's story, she found the courage to search. Eventually, mother and daughter found each other. They had begun rebuilding their relationship. At the end of the letter, Sandra wrote, Thank you for showing me that sometimes it is not too late to do the right thing. Mason looked at Alexander. Our story helped her. Alexander smiled. And probably more people than we'll ever know. 5 years after Evan asked the question that had changed everything, the family gathered again to celebrate a new edition of the book. Mason was preparing for college with plans to study medicine. Caleb was already exploring engineering programs. Evan was still obsessed with soccer. During dinner, Mason raised his glass. I want to make another toast. Everyone laughed. You really like speeches, Caleb said. I am good at them. Mason looked toward Ethan. To my brother. and then smiled. The kid who asked one simple question. It was only the question, and then interrupted. It was Dad being brave enough to search for the answer. Caleb nodded, and Rebecca being brave enough to open her home, and then added, and Valerie being willing to forgive. Mason continued, and Grandma Eleanor loving us before any of this happened. Daniel lifted his glass, and apparently me making brownies. Everyone burst into laughter. Finally, and then said, it worked because everyone chose family. Alexander stood. I want to read something. He opened a copy of their book. Then he read the final passage. Family is not a destination. It is a journey. It is not something that simply exists because people share blood. It is a choice made again and again. We choose family when we decide that love matters more than pride. We choose family when we decide that the future matters more than the mistakes of the past. We choose family when we understand that together we can become stronger than we were alone. Years ago, an 8-year-old boy asked a simple question, Dad, why do those boys look like mech? The answer was painful, complicated, life-changing. But that answer taught us that sometimes the people we need most are standing directly in front of us, waiting for us to ask the right question. It taught us that mistakes, even terrible ones, do not have to define the rest of a person's life. It taught us that forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. It taught us that love requires responsibility. And most importantly, it taught us that family is not defined by how perfectly it begins. Family is defined by how courageously it chooses to continue. When Alexander finished reading, nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Eden asked, Dad, do you really think our story helps people? It already has. How do you know? Because our story is not really about us. Eden looked confused. What is it about? Something almost Iverian understands. Alexander smiled. The power of being loved. Late that night, after everyone had gone back to their homes, Alexander stood alone on the terrace. Rebecca joined him. What are you thinking about? The same thing I think about almost every time I stand here. That question, he smiled. That question. Do you like where the answer led? Alexander looked toward the lights in the neighboring houses. In one, Mason was studying. In another room, Caleb was sketching engineering ideas, and then was reading before bed. Eleanor was watching her favorite television show. Valerie and Daniel were talking on their porch. Alexander wrapped his arm around Rebecca. I am happier than I ever believed I could be. No regrets. Plenty. He looked at her. But regret and gratitude can exist together. I regret the man I used to be. I am grateful I was given the chance to become someone better. Rebecca rested her head against his shoulder. And the future, Alexander smiled. I see Mason becoming a doctor and helping children who never had the opportunities he has now. I see Caleb designing affordable homes for families who need them. I see Evan playing soccer under stadium lights. I see you and me growing old surrounded by children and grandchildren. I see Eleanor becoming the most spoiled grandmother in America. Rebecca laughed. And Valerie and Daniel, happy, at peace. And this strange family of ours. Alexander looked toward all three homes, still growing, still changing, still choosing each other. Rebecca took his hand. It's not a perfect family. No, Alexander smiled. It asked something better. What a real one. And that was how one innocent question from an 8-year-old boy changed not only the life of a millionaire, but the lives of everyone around him. A father found the sons he never knew. Two boys found the father they had spent years wondering about. A wife discovered that opening her heart did not take love away from her own child. A mother learned that forgiveness could exist without erasing the past. An elderly woman who had carried 2 abandoned babies through the hardest years of their lives finally discovered that she would never have to carry the burden alone again. And 3 boys who first recognized one another through familiar eyes, familiar smiles, and familiar faces discovered something far greater than resemblance. They discovered family. Because sometimes the most powerful changes in our lives begin with the simplest questions. Dad, why do those boys look like mech? The answer changed everything. And in the end, it changed everything for the better. Dear listener, what do you think about Alexander's decision? Do you believe he deserved the chance to become a father to Mason and Caleb after so many years? Which moment in this story touched you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next unforgettable story we have prepared for you.